Before we jump into actually learning some SQL, there's a couple of concepts that I want to run through, and I just want to do a bit of preamble on what this series is. So this is another SQL introduction. There's millions of SQL introductions. So why am I making another one? This is specifically aimed at people that use Excel. My videos are going to have Excel on one half of the screen and SQL on the other, so that we can do one thing in Excel and then do exactly the same thing in SQL. I want it to be super easy to bridge the gap between Excel and SQL because they're so similar. I'll make a comment about this in a second, but the flavor of SQL that we're using for the series is going to be Microsoft's SQL, Microsoft SQL Server. So the usual definition, what is SQL? You probably already know SQL is an acronym for Structured Query Language. That means that it's a programming language, it's code, but it's specifically a language oriented around data. But there's lots of different implementations. I'll explain this in a second. Let's think about spreadsheets. I'm going to say that spreadsheets are a general concept. And I'm saying this because there's lots of different tools, lots of different software that implement the concept of a spreadsheet. We've got Microsoft Excel, Google Sheets, LibreOffice, we've got the Apple numbers. There's loads of different software that are spreadsheets. SQL is like spreadsheets. SQL is a general concept. SQL is just code to talk to data. Just like there's lots of different implementations of spreadsheets, there's lots of different implementations of SQL. So that top one, Microsoft SQL Server, that's the one that we're using in this series. But there's loads and loads of different SQL flavors, loads of different SQL implementations. When people are first learning SQL, this isn't obvious. I want to make it really, really clear that you write a specific flavor of SQL. There's loads of similarities between them, but you write a very specific flavor. So when you're learning SQL, if you've got any questions, you want to Google what you're trying to do, make sure you're explicit about the flavor that you're using, because otherwise you might find some answers, some documentation for a flavor that's not the flavor that you're using, and so that answer might not apply to your specific code. So always keep in mind, what flavor of SQL are you using? In the same way that if someone says, well, let's put it in a spreadsheet, you need to think, well, are you going to put it in Excel? Are you going to put it in Google Sheets? Are you going to put it in something else? Exactly the same with SQL. There's a specific SQL implementation. The reason there are so many different implementations is because there's lots of different databases. Each database, it's just a piece of software. That's the best way to think about a database. It's a piece of software that holds tables, kind of like Excel. And so because people can make their own database technology, they write their own SQL flavor. But a database is just something that holds tables, at least a SQL database. It just holds tables like Excel does, like spreadsheet software does. And instead of interacting with it through a spreadsheet, like we do with Excel, we interact with the data via SQL code. But that's all you really need to worry about when it comes to SQL databases. It's just some software that holds some tables, and we talk to that data using SQL. There's a few other things that I'm going to call out now. We're going to see a lot of this in more detail later on, but these are just some important things to mention right now. The first is that SQL sounds like English. SQL code, well, you're writing words, and those words are going to sound a lot like English. We'll see more of this later on. I'll also mention that white space and capitalization in the words that we write are mostly ignored. I'm not going to really make this explicit, so play around with it yourself, or just copy the way that I'm doing the white space and capitalization in my examples. And by white space, I mean spaces, new lines, tabs, that kind of stuff. We've seen that in Excel, anytime you're doing text, you need to put it in double quotes. SQL is a little different. You just put it in single quotes. Again, we're going to see this later on. And finally, because SQL code is just talking to a database, it's asking a database for its data, we often call SQL code a query. So anytime you hear the word query, we're really just referring to SQL code. This is all the context that we need jumping into it, so let's get started.